Welcome everyone. So I had quite a few recordings from Inktober, and some of them are actually complete from start to end, my entire process going all the way through. And they're quite satisfying to just watch. So they're about 2 hours long on average, maybe a little longer. I figured that was a bit too long to sit through. I doubted anyone would want to see that. However, I've sped it up 2 times, and I think that's actually quite a nice, comfortable, sort of meditative range where you can kind of just happily sit and watch it. I mean, I certainly can. I think it will give you some insight into some of the more detailed approaches I take to things, but really it's just might be a nice thing to watch along to. And also it provides a contrast to the previous processes that I put up, because those are sped up vastly more, maybe 30, 40 times speed, because that way you can really see an entire image coming together all at once. But this gives you a sense of sort of how it really feels in real time to go through one of these drawings. As you can see at the beginning, I'm literally just preparing, because it's a difficult process. I mean, I found these really, really challenging. And so having set some sort of style with my previous images, I wanted to make sure that I was being consistent. I do all my little warm-up drawings on the left and then go straight in with ink on the right. So just going back through and having a look and familiarizing myself with exactly how I had approached this sort of topic before. I was also making up a story at the same time. So here it's sort of part of the process is simply just finding what is the next step I want to show in this story. What's the next bit of action or little set piece that I want to display? You can see I'm already sketching out that in this case, I really just want to show that the diver is going through this old cockpit window and getting inside. This is their entry point to this big wreckage in the ocean. And the best way to sort of explore this is to ignore what image I'm going to make and just start trying to plan out the space. So you can see I drew a little sketch of the outside of the window, and I was thinking, well, where else could the camera actually be placed? It could show the inside of the window, which would be a fun scene. So that is the window that I have the diver going towards and eventually going through. And so in this point, I'm thinking, what else can I show from this angle? So this inside shot is actually quite a fun idea. I don't think I ended up doing it, but a really sort of wide perspective, so you can see the entirety of the inside as well as the diver poking their head through. And yeah, just exploring this kind of thing, not really thinking too much about the exact composition of elements within the scene, but really just trying to work out whether the perspective even works. That was kind of my starting point there. And then, once I've got an idea of what this scene could be, it's now trying to see if I can actually fit that into a square format. So I'm using the page of this book essentially as my format for the image. It's a square. I need to make sure that whatever I compose within it feels comfortable in that square. And, this is sort of largely to do with the balance of shapes that I put in there. So you can see I've shaded in little chunks to see what areas I could keep dark, what areas I keep light. How do I get an image like this to feel balanced? So I think I'm just experimenting with a different way that I could show all this stuff on the inside. In this case, it's an image that's kind of from a camera that's lower down. So most of the windows extending above the top of the canvas. And, this poses problems of how do I show that kind of extreme angle without intersecting the camera with some physical part of the actual scene. I think I started to find that this interior shot was a cool idea. It sort of felt nice, as if it was a little call-out sheet for a concept or something, but it was making an illustration very, very difficult. So these were sort of my last attempts, is thinking, how can I show this interior? Would I show a camera that's actually showing part of the inside and with just an invisible wall in the foreground? Do I just kind of break a slight break of realism just to show exactly what I want to? Or shall I really go for a continue on from the shot before? And ultimately, I think that's what I chose to do. Spoilers for the sketch I end up doing, but it's actually one of the most similar pieces I did. It really does feel like a direct carry on from the image before it. And in many ways, I'm sort of a shame that I did this in the end because it shows the least new information. But it also shows exactly what I want in terms of the movement in the scene. So the next thing was just what pose actually makes this feel comfortable? How do I get this character to poke their way through this little window in a way that feels believable, that shows sort of the motion that they would take, perhaps include some of that awkwardness of trying to navigate on the water. Obviously, they have this big, I don't know what to call it, just the diving apparatus on their back. That's going to get in the way, the big air tank. So, how can I solve this? What sort of pose will give me all the information that I want to display, but also make for an interesting and appealing series of shapes in the image? I think now I was going for a top angle, maybe see if I could raise the camera up a little bit. I was having a lot of problems when the camera was close to any of the struts. So when it was like really close to a wall or even just intersecting with the wall, that was causing problems because I couldn't think of a particularly good way to justify that kind of break. So camera outside or camera a good way inside was the best solution for that. Just that there was space around the camera. But I don't know whether this is really that fast or not, but something that I really enjoyed about doing these little sketches on the left is that because I knew I was about to make something which I would sort of be pleased with, it was refined and all that kind of stuff on the right-hand side of the page, I was really just freed up to do whatever I wanted on the left. It felt like one of the most sort of freeing sketching experiences that I'd had for a while. And I don't really know why I haven't given myself that kind of freedom in the past, or I don't know why that hasn't felt like that before. This isn't, I say before as in forever. I think it's just when I draw digitally, for example, when I'm sketching out ideas digitally, because I can erase and modify and stuff so easily, I'm far less likely to discard, move to the next bit of the image and start doing something new. Instead, I can edit it. I can make it look exactly how I want it to. So if I do a sketch which seems like a nice camera angle, but the composition's a little off, or it's not that interesting, or not that dynamic, I can fix all of that stuff. And so the previous versions don't get saved. Instead of making new layers, a lot of the time I'm literally just working over the thing I've just drawn. And I suppose the shame there is that you lose that progress that you make through each image. So you can see here I go through each of those thumbnails, get to the one that I like, and then it's just a process of working out exactly how I want to arrange the shapes within there. You can also see I drew an even smaller little thumbnail, and that was just showing the general gesture of the character and how it might interplay with the big, strong, sort of curved lines of the cockpit window itself. And then it was a matter of how can I make sense of her putting her diving kit through first. I figured it would be a nice detail, carrying on from what I was saying earlier about the awkwardness and like the difficulties of trying to get through a space like this. If she had to actually take off the big tank on the back and push that through the window first, or at least pull it through afterwards, because the window simply isn't big enough for both at once. I think that would be a really nice detail. It sort of adds this believability. It makes it a little more interesting than it would otherwise be, especially since so many of the other scenes are going to be just normal, where none of that extra clothing or equipment is taken off. Instead, they're just drifting through, making a different pose, and being seated in a different environment. So a lot of these things, I think, just make stuff a lot more interesting. It's like when you can put in something like this, it feels like extra effort, I suppose. It's difficult. As soon as you've got something that varies from what you've just done, you've got to work out exactly the mechanics of that, how it fits together, how that affects the composition. So I think a lot of the time it's very easy to just not do this, especially because it doesn't make this singular illustration particularly better in like, at least when removed from the rest of the series. In fact, it may make it make a little less sense. If you just had this image alone, you actually don't get a sense of what the diver looks like most of the time, because you're showing her without the equipment attached to our back. However, in a series, it just adds more value. You already know what it looks like on our back. You don't want to see that again. That's a little uninteresting. So looking for opportunities like that, I think at least I find that I have to really deliberately look for those opportunities. Unless I'm thinking to do something a bit extra, the default and sort of most basic format of whatever image is always the thing that comes to my head first. And then because I can execute on it quicker, I get to pleasing visuals faster than I would otherwise, which means that I start to latch on to something and find that that's just an easier solution to go with. I think this one might have been a process that I actually streamed originally, and hence I'm maybe flicking back and forth a little more to explain previous parts of the image. And also I did that little demo of how line work can sort of squish in perspective to better imbue your lines with more information that sort of shows how it fits in space. At this point, I actually scurried off and tested out a Copic marker. I cut it out of the footage here just because it was a long pause, but I tried the Copic marker on this page because I was thinking that it might be an easy way to fill in large areas of black. However, I tried it on the page, and I think due to the fact that it's an alcohol-based ink, it went straight through the page and appeared on the other side. And since I was doing all of these back-to-back, I really didn't want to fill my next blank page with the bleed-through of the previous image. So I didn't do that. Interestingly, the ink that I use, so I think it's an Indian ink, it dries, it's a permanent one. It's not soluble. That doesn't go through the page whatsoever. So in some of these processes, I've just painted layers and layers of this dark ink on, and yeah, it happily sits on one side of the page and doesn't come through at all. You can just about see the outlines of it, but that's literally just because of the light that can diffuse through, rather than the ink itself. So that was really nice to have. I'm not really sure exactly why there's so much difference between the two, but that's why I ultimately chose that Copic markers just weren't going to do it for me. Anyway, exciting bits happening now. Well, I say exciting. I'm just going to spend quite a while plotting out little marks over the page just so I can get a rough idea of the perspective before I go in and put those objects into space. As much as I try in this case to actually plot this stuff out beforehand, and I'm doing it really loose so that basically if any of these lines are in the wrong place, I can just ignore them, I can draw over them afterwards. I really wasn't entirely happy with how I plotted out this space compared to the little sketches I have on the left. It did not have the same extremity of the angle that I wanted, and it was a bit wonky in a lot of places. I can criticize this. It may look fine in the end, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that I detailed a lot of it to sort of cover up some of those mistakes. But yeah, I found it quite difficult. Certainly during the process, a lot of it was covering up stuff, or at least gently trying to shift lines with line weight so that they would represent the intended position of those lines a little better. You can also see here that I wasn't exactly sure where I was going to have the overlap. I think in my original sketch, the bar was going to be in front of her body in that central section. And so I'd left it slightly open because I wasn't sure. And at this point, I think I then realized that I wanted more of an overlap. So I've left it open now, essentially planning and hoping that I can have her body in front of at least one of those pillars, and then behind another. Of course, the one by the arm is a clear, she'll be behind that. But again, it's a very difficult thing that feels sort of, with hindsight, you're like, oh, well, clearly this thing would have looked better. This thing, this extra overlap really helps sell the image, all that kind of thing. But it's very hard to think ahead in this space. It's where you want to actually draw it in and see whether it looks good or not before you then commit to those lines, which is great. You can do that in digital, you can undo, you can just make new layers, sketch over the top. you don't have such liberties with traditional. And so same thing with just like adding a hand. I find myself, I sort of got locked up and I went, okay, I need to make this look good. And I sort of didn't trust myself to just be able to wing it. And so you can see I sketched a couple of hands in the bottom middle of the screen, just trying to work out exactly what shape I wanted it to be. And I think a lot of the time, the best thing that that can do for you is that it gives you an overall shape to pay attention to. Because if you try and draw out individual fingers, construct, like piece those together to make a hand, you're sort of guaranteed to have a hand that feels unnatural. Fingers don't align to the right place, or they're all too big or too small. A lot of the time, you have no gesture really when you're doing that kind of approach. And so trying to get that overall shape of the hand first and then fitting fingers within, I find it helps a lot with getting the right proportions and the right motion. Of course, I would normally do that with a sketch underneath. So in this case, I just had to try and work that out beforehand and sort of ingrain it as best as possible. And so rather than going back to the pencil, even just doing it with the pen sort of gives you that little bit extra confidence to make sure you're going to get it right. So yeah, some of this stuff is really nice to draw in though. So you can see those little sort of abstract circle things that she has on her shoulder pads. There's no hesitation when I draw those things in because really I'm just orienting small little discs in perspective. And I'm not being too accurate with it either. So like it feels very easy to just go in. It's going to be an appealing texture regardless because lots of little circles with sort of some nice detailed shading to give it an impression of material or lighting. It just always looks good. I see that on a lot of like fun armor designs. They can have just like little discs of metallic material overlapping with each other. I think I've used that in a couple of designs myself. It's just very nice. It's sort of an easy, appealing shape or pattern to fall back on. So in this case, it does exactly that. And it means that compared to pretty much everything else, which is kind of drawn with far more intent, I can just happily draw those things all day. Like it doesn't provide anywhere near as much challenge as trying to get a hand right or trying to put a leg in the right place. And speaking of challenge, trying to put this this air tank in the right position. Now I'm pretty sure I end up drawing this upside down, even though, sorry, I say upside down. I think I was hoping to do it upside down. It made sense that the end which had the air supply to the snorkel or to the mouthpiece would be closer. And so I kept telling myself, yes, I'll do this upside down. That'll make more sense. And then I ended up drawing it the right way around because I think that it was ingrained in my head that way already. All of my designs, all of my drawings, even prior, it had been oriented so that the ball was at the top. And this might even be the moment where I realized, oh no, I've just messed it up. I've just done exactly what I didn't want to do. Because you can see on the left, I have drawn my backpack upside down. Yep, there we go. I'm tapping it furiously because I'd just done the complete opposite of what I was meaning to. So I think at this point, I try and salvage it. I try and go, well, that line I've put in already, that can become something else. I might turn it into seaweed or maybe even turn it into the straps on the back. But it's always very fun because, again, there's just a few lines in and I go, crap. That's exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. Regardless, we managed to salvage it, but it obviously requires quite a bit of sort of solving because now I'm trying to think, how do I put this this object in? But now I have no free space. I need to make sure that I'm getting my overlaps correct. Overlaps for things that I haven't even decided what I want them to be yet. So you can see I'm now putting in some of that stuff to just be like some sort of seaweed or debris so that I can at very least say I need not to worry about these overlaps anymore. That's one thing off like the mental sort of I don't know what to call it. All the problems I'm trying to solve at once. That's one thing that I can tick off. You know, it may not be the best solution, but I no longer have to worry about what exactly is overlapping it. So now I can just focus on the orientation of the tank again. And then I sort of struggle through this and I get it right eventually. But yeah, it's always really fun to see this kind of thing happen real time. I suppose it's often too fast in an overly sped up process video to cover. It's also so sort of unimportant it feels when doing a voiceover like this that, yeah, normally it just gets forgotten. But I have the extra time this time. So I can really go into the pitfalls and the perils that I went through trying to piece this thing together. I don't know if this is really the same, but a lot of the time I feel people appreciate it when the sort of more human errors and mistakes and all of the stuff that isn't seen in the final product is shown by an artist. I don't know if this is a particularly good example of that, but a lot of the time you don't really get to see the difficulty that went into making a piece. You just see the final. You just get this impression that things just sort of come naturally, or they planned it out right and so it came out perfect first time. And of course that is not the way it is. You can see now I'm also struggling with that overlap at the middle. I've left very little space. It's much thinner than all the others. And also that piece of window, that seems to be covering a much larger space than I think it should. Especially with the size that I made the other windows. And so I'm just starting to find that a lot of the things I've already put in aren't quite lining up like I want them to. But again, we go back and we fix all of these things later on. Easy things to add, like hair. That's another one where really I can just rely on the fact that making shapes that sort of flow into each other and look appealing, that I can render with a bit of interesting lighting later. I sort of know that that's a safe area of the image. I am freed from specific forms and things like that, and so I can use it to help accentuate perspective and stuff. Ultimately, those are nice rests. When I'm putting those bits in, my heart rate has calmed down, and then I go back to trying to draw something like the leg, and I'm going, crumbs, this is difficult again. I'd say this little cable here is the same. You can see I drew it at that little sketch line because I misinterpreted my original sketch and went, I thought that was the edge. I then quickly stopped drawing that and picked up where the actual edge of that beam would be. But now with that sort of beam thickness in mind, I'm really seeing the issues that I've already created in that central section where it crosses her belly, and I'm starting to try and find solutions to fix that problem. And then now that we've got our sort of mid-ground object in, I've got the foreground bars in the front, and I'm starting to plot out a couple of the ones that will be seen in the background. But yeah, this whole section of it is sort of slow and painful because it was slow and painful when I was doing it. There were just a lot of problems I was trying to solve at once, and I was finding it all very difficult. The other interesting thing is that if I actually go back and compare it, this could be explained away with some sort of effects of the camera being closer or further away, but the actual size of these windows have increased a lot, certainly compared to the thickness of the frames. Luckily, I don't think it really comes through as an obvious mistake when you go through the images sequentially, but it's certainly there. They're almost twice as big as they used to be. And despite constructing this whole pose based on the fact that I wanted it to look like these windows were too small for her to travel through with her diving equipment on her back, I then accidentally made them big enough that she could easily have gotten through with just a careful and slow motion. So, there's a bunch of things that just didn't really come together like I wanted them to. But that's not a huge issue. You can see I've, looking back at and getting the reference of the exact sort of curvature that I wanted on this this cockpit, I could start to more confidently place in those lines on the back. But I still want to make sure that I'm referencing as much as possible to make sure I get that right. I've realized that, like I'd shown previously, I want to show that one of these panels is opening inwards. That's quite important. I still haven't decided what I'm going to do, so I'm drawing around her midriff. I don't know whether I want it to overlap or not. So I've started to darken a bit of that outline, but it's not clear yet exactly what I want to do. And then the last thing is that because I want to make sure that there's a nice overlap of elements in the foreground, I can just put in some of these more easy, relaxing shapes. In this case, it's just sort of seaweed, random sea debris, and I can put that in on top. This is quite a fun bit because, again, I'm just making appealing shapes, not worrying about getting too specific with things. And it means that I can make sure when I block in further details of that back portion of the cockpit, I'm not going to make any more overlap mistakes. And so I'm thickening that bar even more, just pushing it a little further each time to try and cover up that initial error. I think ultimately it's fine because just the way that I present it and shade it means that, if I want to cover up some lines that I accidentally put in the wrong spot, I just need to find a justification to fill it in with black, essentially. As soon as you fill everything in black, there's no distinction between areas that were accidentally drawn over prematurely or not. And so you start to perceive it all as one big contiguous space. In the same way that when you want to draw an overlap, you draw that shape out first so that you corner that off and make sure that it's all white. That's why we perceive it as a continuous and solid object. Well, in this case, I just need to make sure that I can fill those areas in as all black. And then that too will make you perceive it as a continuous object. That is the last resort, of course, because if it's all black, then presumably it needs to be in shadow. And then once you make one part of the image all black and sort of introduce the potential for a shadow that dark, suddenly a lot of parts of the image look like they have that potential. And as much as I enjoyed putting in the ink with the paintbrush, that takes a lot longer, filling in all of that stuff. And I didn't really want to extend this process longer than I already had. Remember back in Inktober, I was trying to crank one of these out each day after a day of work and, fitting other things in the evening. Making dinner, relaxing a bit, all that kind of stuff. So 2, sometimes 3 hours was really the maximum that I was going to spend on these images. And having experienced how long it took, because I think I did my first image that was like in darkness with a lot of black around the edge. I think I did that at the weekend. And so I could feel how much longer that took than the normal sketches or the normal drawings. And to be honest, a big part of that was just because I was actually filling in all of the background. So instead of just showing the center, so the I guess the focal point of the image, and then leaving the rest in kind of like a obscured, hazy state. When you are filling in the entire image with black, then you have to do something in those areas. You can't just have it flat, otherwise that would imply something different for your lighting or for the structure of your internals. And because the internal sections of this abandoned craft, because it's all quite tight, they're supposed to feel like claustrophobic spaces. I couldn't just have stuff disappear into darkness over large expanses. I had to put something in there to show that even though it's dark and fully black, there's elements which are still very close to you, very close to the camera and very close to the character in the scene. Otherwise, I just lose that feeling of claustrophobia. But yeah, you can see that now that I'm using this, it's sort of like a calligraphy pen. It's the Tombow fudenosuke, firm-tipped pen, and I love it. Compared to the hi-tec C, which I'd been using previously, it can go from a very thin line if I'm controlled, but it can go to a very thick line very quickly. And sort of with normal use, not sort of trying to push hard or be particularly light, it just gives you this sort of medium thickness. And even just using that and a couple bits of that thicker line, I can start to separate out forms, push things back, and use line weight to actually separate those forms better. So where I'm confident on a shape or where I want to sort of redirect the eye. So, I've kind of slightly changed the way that hip is formed. Once I've made the decision, I can sort of confidently go in and use this line, and it largely distracts you from any sort of imperfect line that I had before. So I finally committed to making sure that this part of the ship was in front of her waist. I could commit with that big thick line, and I'm leaving most things open still because, again, my previous suggestion of I could just fill that bar in with black, that doesn't quite work because the suit of the diver is black already, and the main stylization I've had up to this point, as you can see in these two images, the main stylization is that I just fill that in black and leave one sort of main reflective light across the surface. So I'd realized that it would look weird, and possibly it would be a much more noticeable mistake than, say, the size of the windows changing, as if she goes from having a white suit to a black suit, because she's the focal point. So I put that in to remind myself that I cannot just cover this this bar of the window with black to solve those errors. I'm going to have to just be very careful with where I put in lines and put in value moving forward. And, like anything else, because I have the rest of the image to draw, I was feeling a bit stuck there, so I decided I'd just move elsewhere. A big part of that is because if I actually have the focal point as the face, or the shoulders, or even the air tank that she's pushing through ahead of her, if that had to be the focal point, then I can make sure I work on those areas first, and then I can treat the other ones slightly differently. So I could leave out detail, or I could try and keep the contrast lower so that those are sort of secondary reads in the image. And that's another great way to essentially draw attention away from previous mistakes. The other thing that I'm keeping in mind, and I'm now addressing here, is that a lot more of these sort of secondary details that I can show on top, like barnacles across the glass of the windows, that's something I do need to do before I fill in any more of the background. So I started to put in little lines of barnacles, essentially filling in the gaps that I'd already left, mostly by chance, but also because I was being cautious. Filling in some of those gaps just to provide a bit more of that interesting overlap that I can really capitalize on later on. So I've put in some of those barnacles already, and I'll continue to do so across the other windows. Obviously, there's areas where I could have done it earlier. I could have had some barnacles cover areas of her body. And whilst that would have just made it more difficult to plan again, I think in this case, because I can't differentiate things with value at all, I think it would make it very difficult to actually show exactly what's going on. Is this circular barnacle shape actually hovering on a window in front of her? Or is it just some strange extension of those shapes we already have in her shoulder piece? So I'm conscious that when shapes are too similar to each other and you're in a color scheme which is just black and white, it can be very difficult to distinguish what's foreground, what's background. And so I keep those barnacles away. And, in this case, the only way that we really know that they're actually on the window and not just random blobs floating inside the water is that I can show it interacting with the metal struts. And so that's another very important part of their integration. I need to make sure they're always by a reference barnacle, which is shown to be contacting those metal struts so that you can actually position it in space properly. Anyway, I'm getting a bit more confident at this point. I've filled in a big area of black that I was sort of putting off for a while before. And that's given me, I guess, the confidence to go in and put these legs in, seeing as those are also very important parts of the image. They're a big source of the appeal. You like the character, you want to see their pose and their the flow of their gesture. That's a big part of making the image interesting to look at. But also they are that big sort of striking change to the composition, which is otherwise this big blob in the top right. Essentially, we just have this big, large area filling up most of the image, and then this one sort of spike just poking into it. That's what gives us the motion. That's what gives us that sort of overarching feeling of one object entering another. And it's why I also try and keep the area around her entry point a bit clearer than the rest of the scene. I'm filling up the bottom right and top left. I'll fill those up with random debris and stuff But the bottom left, I keep clear except for the little octopi, because they're a nice part of the story to link all the screens together. And if I put them towards the bottom left and don't bring them too close to that entry point, they're not too distracting because they're quite discrete objects. They're small and they don't overlap too much. And something actually that, speaking of overlaps, that I didn't actually achieve with any of these is having the foresight to draw one of those octopus in beforehand. So at no point, I don't think, do any of those little octopuses actually cover the main character or cover any of the important objects in the scene. And that's always because for some reason I actually just forgot about them every time until I'd finished the drawing and went, oh yeah, I have that little character that I've sort of had running through the entire series thus far. I need to put them in somewhere. And so they always just fill up a blank space at the end. Yeah, here it looks like I'm going for some more growth, more stuff that can show a bit of that contouring of the inside and also show exactly where that window is. So despite being an organic shape, I'm trying to show that it's kind of wrapping around with the form, as if you'd taken a texture that was filled with random shapes and you'd warped that into place. You'll start getting relationships between those shapes within there that kind of adhere to what you would draw if it was just a square grid covering the form. It's something that's worth remembering because even though you are being organic with whatever shape you're putting in, you've got to imagine that square grid and imagine the utility that that square grid gives to your image for its readability. You know, square grids are great because they make reading forms incredibly easy. The only problem is they just look like lazy, boring sci-fi stuff. Maybe even they just look a bit like if you're at all familiar with sort of game development, you'll just immediately see that as default texture positioning for like a game engine or something. You know, it comes with its own feeling. Obviously, it's not going to work in this case. It would imply that the windows were sort of split up or something, but you want to think about how well they work and why they work for giving you information about the space, and then just try and apply other objects to that. So, you know, in this case, what I could have done is imply that there were some sort of vents in the window or rivets or something in the window that might strengthen it, and those would be justifiably laid out in a regular square pattern. And as long as I was accurate with how I laid those patterns out, I would be able to get away with just sort of putting that sort of information in. And there would be extra little points in space that can help communicate perspective. You can see something that I'm doing at this point is trying to get that squint read of some of the lines coming through the entire piece. So if you squint your eye, you can see that those little areas of dark shading, sort of to the top left of the character's head. That's something where I really wanted to show that there was objects in the way that was breaking up the read of that shape. However, squinting your eyes, you can still feel that line going through. And trying to get some of that squint read on these larger shapes that really impact your sense of the perspective, that becomes very important here, because if I covered it with too much detail at first, then I'm never going to be able to get that quick read back again. So here, again, the easy thing is to fill areas in with black. You know, it's an additive process. You can always add more and more areas filled in with darkness. And that's largely what I do to solve this problem. But I need to be careful with where I do it, because again, that will just spoil the potential for interesting overlaps. But there are some cases where, you know, I'm happy to start doing this a bit more. So for example, I'm going to use the spaces around the edge of the central action. That's where I'm going to emphasize perspective information, because really there's nothing else going on in there. Meanwhile, in the middle, certainly where this air tank is, I don't need to worry about that as much. In that position, you're really just looking at an object. That's the most important part of that image. or if that portion of the image. And so I can focus on just making those objects read nicely, and using my full value range, which again, it's strange to describe value range when I'm working in just black and white, but really it's to do with like the density of darkness or the density of detail. That's kind of my equivalent of value range when doing these drawings. And yeah, here I get to use that full range. All of the texture, all of the detail, areas of white, areas of full black, without worrying about what's going on in the back. I will get my perspective information from other areas of the image and not worry about trying to put it in here. This does differ a bit to how I'd approach this if I was painting it, because with painting I can more easily separate objects out. I could have this floating in front, but because I can have such control of the values passing behind it, I can still make very clear relationships between a value that appears on the left of the object and then reappears on the right of the object. If those are the right shapes, then despite being completely blocked in the middle, your brain's very, very good at linking those two spots together and understanding that there is actually a shape passing behind. And that works great with painting. You can get so much more depth because of it, especially in areas that already have, I guess, what you'd call a focal point. If I did that in this case, I would have to be very careful with how I laid that out. So I could have sort of similar to that dark beam I was drawing in that top left. I could have just a big chunk, a dark silhouette passing behind it. But if I connected that at the wrong place with that object, then it will be very easy to perceive that as part of the object instead. In fact, a similar conundrum happens when I'm trying to work out what to do with this leg in the foreground. My previous stylization would say that I fill almost the entirety of this in with darkness, with shadow. But what do I do now? Do I merge those silhouettes completely? I've already kind of put in some line weight, which is actually doing a lot of good for communicating the perspective and just getting a nice flow to these legs. So taking that away could potentially spoil those. It could make the shape that I chose to create not really indicative of what I wanted to show. I talk about this a bit in my line weight tutorial, but when a line remains perceivable as a line, as this leg line was here, then when you decide to thicken the line, you're actually trying to thicken it from the middle in both directions, so to the left and to the right in this case. And that's because we perceive it as a line and therefore understand the sort of true position of that line to be in the center. However, when that becomes a full dark silhouette, now we start to see the outer boundary of a shape, which is actually pushed quite away from that center line. You can see that's already happening with that intersection, where I've drawn that leg behind. Because it joins the leg with a fully dark shape, we start to see that the leg in front, we understand it as only being where it is white and not seeing that line that is composed of that thicker shape. So it's a difficult one to deal with. You can see obviously in this case, I'm like, that's a problem that I'm just going to have to solve later. I think it's partly because if it really feels like it's out of place when the rest of the image is done, I'll know whether I need to change it or not. It may not look too strange if I kind of change the exposure across the whole image. So, a way to justify it not having the darkness of previous places is that it may be in more light. And so if I show the rest of the image also in more light, then perhaps that makes sense. Meanwhile, if I then actually go a lot darker with the top left of the image, top right of the image, and I suppose top left and bottom right corners, then it's going to look even stranger that it's as bright as it is. So I will have even more reason that I need to do something about it just to make sure that it feels like it's fitting in the same environment. But yeah, because most of my hard work is done at this point, the difficult things, the sort of things that I don't so much as dread, but just know that are going to be very hard to execute, and the places that are crucial for the image reading well, those are largely done at this point. I can just focus on enhancing the shapes that I've already got. I've got a slightly less than ideal construction of this cockpit, but I'm going to have to just go with what I've got. And, that's nice and that's freeing at this point. I'm not worried about making mistakes now because I can't make too many mistakes at this point. At least not ones that sort of have implications for the rest of the drawing. Sure, I could accidentally draw a line in the wrong place, but it doesn't actually, that wouldn't change the perception of the perspective in the scene. That would just make for a slightly odd read in a certain region of the image. And so now I can really just go in and fiddle around with the details. These little pockets of like full darkness are very, very useful. I often use them for areas that are supposed to be overlapping, areas that are coming into contact with each other. It's like a very extreme version of a contact shadow or ambient occlusion. And then in many places, it's just a way to make something stand out more than it did before. So here I very carefully sort of construct that last little bounding shape just to give it as much separation from the window as possible, but also to continue that dark shape going through. I sort of knew that I needed to from the beginning, and here's the same thing with the leg here. I need to be consistent with how I shade that torso to make sure that it has that contiguous feeling, so that we can really feel the overlap over the front. And I've managed to hide those areas where I actually overextended those lines right at the beginning. So it's not too bad at this point. Yeah, honestly, I don't think I have too much more to say about this one. So I might just let this play out till the finish. You've heard enough of my voice. I think I've rambled enough. So thank you for watching. Hope that was useful. I've got a couple more of these that I'll put out. I don't know if I'll voice over all of them, but I think it's good to just discuss this kind of thing, especially in a format where I'm really not worried about spending too much time going over one topic. So yeah, I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.